Hey, Mark, thanks for having me and giving me the opportunity here to share with the audience about my Let's Talk Grief program that I'm debuting as I'm traveling across the country in my beautiful camper van. My name again is Hogan Hilling, and that's my son Wesley Jordan Hilling, who passed away a couple of years ago. And on the other photo is me with Bridget Bagley, who is the creator of Preston's Charm, which my mission for Let's Talk Grief is to create a healthier, optimistic grief culture with a bigger platform and louder voice for people to feel safe and comfortable talking about grief and healing together in harmony. I'd like to begin about how this fabulous grief journey started. In 2021, I decided to sell my house and buy an RV. And my goal was to do this for 1 year. But 3 months into my trip, I had the pleasure of meeting a couple by the name of JR and Tammy Adams. And on the day after Christmas, 3 months into my trip, they wanted to give me a gift. And I was expecting a box with ribbons on it. But instead, they gave me a charm, which you'll see on the presentation there, Preston's Charm. And they told me the story about the charm. And Bridget Bagley is there with me at Preston's gravesite. Preston passed away in 2018, Staff Sergeant, Special Forces, and was hit by a drunk driver on his way back to the barracks. It was a devastating loss for Bridget. And for 2 years, she struggled trying to manage grief the traditional way. And then she decided to turn to her crafting abilities, made this charm, and innocently made about 10 charms, gave one to her husband, four to her surviving sons, and a few friends. And it kind of just snowballed to the point where other people were asking for the charms. And people started leaving them in places they visited. On the back of the charm were instructions on what to do with the charm. You can either leave the charm where you found it, or you could take it with you and hang on to it for as long as you like, or pass it to somebody else. So anyway, people started just passing it around, and eventually Bridget wound up making about 1,500, about 800 of Preston's charms are in circulation. When I called her to interview her to learn more about the charm, I found her story fascinating, and I asked her to send me more charms and told her I would leave one of Preston's charm in every state. So after I completed the journey with Preston's Charm, I returned to Bridget's house and met her for the first time in Winslow, Arizona, and became even more intrigued by her story. And we went to visit Preston's grave. And then after that, we went to her house. And I told her I was an author and said I would like to write your story. And she said yes. And so we started working on publishing the book. Well, a year after Preston passed away, my son, Wesley Jordan Hilling, passed away. That's what led me to continue on my trip. But eventually, Bridget made charms for Wesley, and I took Wesley's charm and Preston's charm around the world. But the inspiration for Let's Talk Grief really started about a few months ago when I met a friend of mine, E.J. Hanhart, lost his wife to cancer. And I reached out to him, and because I was still on the road, I wanted content for my Facebook page where I was journaling. I asked him if he would write an essay and accept charms for his wife, Wendy, who passed away. And he graciously agreed. And then I asked him if I could reach out to his three teenage children, EJ, our Jules, 22, Eddie Jr., 21, and Ellie, 17. And they graciously wrote essays too. And after I read them, I was so inspired by what they were doing and how they kept their family together despite the grief. And, in such a short amount of time was just incredible that they opened their hearts out to me. After reading that, that's what motivated me to start this Let's Talk Grief campaign across the United States. Okay, I want to share just some interesting grief statistics and death and grief statistics with you. We won't really recognize the grievers, and most grievers are not really seen. In the United States, every day, 8,000 people are dying. And based on the average of attendance at funerals, that's 100 for just simple mathematics. That's 800,000 people every day are affected by grief. And when you look at the numbers compared to the attendance at support groups, which is averages about 15 per month, and national conferences, maybe 100 to 200 people, the numbers just don't compute. So that's another reason why I decided to start this Let's Talk Grief project. As you listen to me talk about grief, you'll notice that I bring a different perspective because I live by this motto. I am convinced that life is 10% what happens to me and 90% of how I react to it. So here's an interesting story that I want to share with you that kind of emphasizes if you change the narrative of grief and you change the outcome. So there are two salesmen that wake up one morning. One says, "It's pouring rain outside. I'm not going to make any sales today." The other salesman says, "Let's go, baby. It's pouring rain outside. You know what that means. Every house I knock on is going to have a customer inside. Today is going to be an amazing day of sales." It was raining for both salesmen. The difference was their story. One was negative and other positive. There are two sides to grief. Grief can bring out the worst in a person, but it can also bring out the best. Which narrative would your loved one who passed away like to see you choose? I want to share a little bit about my wonderful son, Wesley Jordan Hilling. He was born with a rare disability and disabled for life. And I'm sharing the story about raising him because there's a comparison between the grief I experienced as a parent of a child with special needs and the grief of death. I was grieving Wesley every day he was alive because I was he couldn't play catch with me. He couldn't talk. He couldn't walk. Just all the dreams that I had for him as in having a father-child relationship were gone. Why did I call it Let's Talk Grief? Because the biggest challenge is that nobody wants to talk about grief. And what that has done is to create what I call the Mexican standoff. Yeah, what usually happens is, the grievers are kind of isolated. They're so caught up in their own pain that they don't realize how isolated they are, and they're afraid to talk to other people about their grief because sometimes the reaction they get is not very positive. And then you have the people that are there that want to say something to the griever, but they don't know what to say or when to say it. And in the end, they don't say anything or they don't do anything. One of these things that usually happens with the grievers is they wind up getting stuck in grief. But I use the analogy with quicksand. A lot of people think that you cannot get out of quicksand by yourself, but you can. There's actually steps that you can take to get out of the quicksand. And it's the same thing with grief. There are actually steps that I created to show you how you can get out of being stuck in grief. I came across an interesting quote about being stuck. It was from Mel Robbins. She wrote the book Let Them. It's a beautiful book, and I would recommend reading it. But she says, everyone will experience being stuck at some level, but it's not a permanent state. A person can also view it as a signal from your brain to work on personal growth and that you need to do something different to help you move forward with life. So why did I name it 8 Steps Back? Because in order to move forward after a traumatic experience such as grief, sometimes a person needs to take a few steps back to temporarily withdraw from a situation or activity to gain perspective and clarity. How I developed the methodology is pretty interesting. The book that I wrote before Preston's Charm was called Solving Cold Cases, which I wrote with a good friend of mine, Joe Kennedy, who's an international cold case expert. And during the process, he was introducing a methodology on how to solve cold cases. And I thought to myself, you know what? And the research that I did, and I don't see any curriculum that helps people get unstuck and be able to move forward. So I thought, well, if Joe can create a methodology for solving cold cases, I thought, why not create a methodology to kind of help solve the issue of getting unstuck from grief. So what are the 8 steps back to relieve grief? The first step is talk about grief. The second one is embrace the grief. Step number 3, substitute anger with grace. Step 4, substitute selfish with selfless and practice empathy. Step 5, substitute sadness with happiness. Step 6, substitute fear with reassurance. Step 7, substitute turmoil with peace. And step 8, help other people relieve their grief. So I want to kind of demonstrate something to you. And for all intents and purposes, I'm not going to bring 5 volunteers up, but I have this pie chart that kind of demonstrate what I'm trying to convey to you. So this is a pie resembling the family and also friends, relatives, and as you can see, the slices of pie. In this case, they're all equal, but in some dynamics, they may not be equal, but they're like a bunch of large pieces to the pie. Well, after a death occurs in a family, this is what the pie looks like for every person that's surviving in that family. So, like in other words, the husband's pie would look like the husband's or dad's pie would look like this. The blue cover covers his pain and grief that he's dealing with, and you can see everybody else is just a sliver of the pie. Same thing with the wife or mother. Same thing with the let's say the 3 surviving children. So essentially, what happens is there's such separation within the family unity. Well, what 8 steps does, it rebuilds the grief pie with a new recipe because now it's a new version of a family that everyone has to create. And as you look left to right, it starts out and it grows every step you take. You can see how the pie slices go back to where they were before. This is just to give you a visual, 8 step back helps create a new version of a family that grieves and heals together in harmony. If you look at the second pie where people are grieving, they're all grieving differently and in different ways, but they're not grieving together in harmony. So the whole idea of following these 8 steps is that to bring the family together so that they can learn how to grieve in harmony. So step 1, let's talk about that real quickly. There's this rule and that I've used and applied. I used to facilitate fathers groups. So I did it for 30 years. And this same rule we used applies to what they utilize in support groups. And it was well intended, but if you just indulge me and take a moment to look at my perspective on this, the rule is what is said in the room stays in the room. Well, the message that it's conveying is that the only safe place to talk about your grief and your pain is in that room. That is why nobody wants to talk about it outside the room. And the other thing too is, you're trying to express your feelings about grief and you're just pretty much saying that you're keeping a secret inside. Well, when you go to a support group and you go home, you don't feel like home is the same place because the support group said that's the only place you should be talking about it. And again, one of my mottos with Let's Talk Grief is that we should talk about it anytime, any place. So then now that you talk about grief, how and when do you talk about it? And as I mentioned before, anytime and any place. Preston's charm has brought an interesting element and factor into this because Preston's charm is kind of an icebreaker. As I toured the country, I'm actually wearing Preston's charm and Wesley's charm, and people are always asking me why I'm wearing the charm, and I start talking about it, and it opens up conversation to talk about grief. In some cases, the person I'm talking to has lost a loved one. So I wind up telling them about Preston's charm, and I give them one. And a lot of the people I met during this journey have essays in Preston's charm book, and a lot of them also have charms of their loved ones. And they have been able to utilize that not only as an icebreaker, but also as a way to comfort their grief. So you have to know how not to talk about grief. When there is anger, sadness, anguish, doom, and gloom in a griever's voice, people will typically not be receptive to listening and practicing empathy. But I discovered when a griever speaks with grace, peace, happiness, and empathy, people will be receptive and offer help and support. As I'm taking care of Wesley, and as I mentioned, I'm grieving every day and I'm finding ways to cope because I'm just focusing on creating the best life for him. And one of the things that was different about me was that I never saw Wesley's disability. I just saw Wesley. So that really helped me manage my grief better. So I think it was like, 2 or 3 years into caring for Wesley, this wonderful friend, Mylene Chow, came to my house and she said, hey, Hogan, how are things going? And typical answer, everybody does this, it's going okay. And Mylene said, no, it's not. She goes, I know that you guys are struggling. You need to tell me what's going on because people in this community want to help and they don't know how to help you. And what marvelous advice she gave us. And so I gave her a list of things that we needed and told her about our struggles financially, also our struggles with the medical industry and getting support from the Developmental Disabilities Agency. Next thing I know, people are bringing meals to us that are pre-cooked. We were receiving checks to help us financially. And then about 2 months later, the Irvine Police Department showed up and donated a handicapped bicycle. I had no idea that Mylene Chow had did a fundraiser with the police department so we could get this handicapped bicycle, which at that time cost $2,000. Step two, embrace the grief. One of the most difficult things is to look at grief and treat it as an ally and a companion and not a burden or an adversary. You know, what I've done, and a lot of the people that I've met that actually I've submitted essays to, is that we've decided to face grief head on. And not all storms come to disrupt your life. Some come to clear your path. I think that's a wonderful quote. It was created by Paul Coelho, a Brazilian author. So I found this other quote too. You know, it goes back to my whole view of life, you know, the whole 10%, 90% rule. And Gordon Ramsay, I heard him during an interview. He said, "My number one rule to living a high performance life is never fear a storm. Learn to dance in the rain." Step three, substitute anger with grace. It's okay to feel angry. It's a natural emotion. But the problem is so many people, even the special needs community, um, continue to carry it with them 24/7. And I love this little cartoon. It's okay to be angry, but it's never okay to be cruel, because what happens when people get angry, they tend to be able to do cruel things to other people. And anger exacerbates the grief. It's like pouring salt on a wound. Here's another interesting thing that just kind of popped in my head, because it's a comment I received a lot when I was raising Wesley. It's, you know, God doesn't give you more than you can handle. And again, it's well intended. But when people were saying that to me, I was thinking to myself, I don't think God is up in heaven looking down and going like, okay, you know what? We're going to give Hogan and Tina a disabled child because I think they can handle it. Well, if you look at the special needs community, the divorce rate is 80%. So if you take into consideration the statistics on that, God's success rate is pretty poor. Even when parents place their kids in homes, after they place them in the home, I would probably say 90 to 95% of the parents wind up abandoning the child. I want to share my path to grace with raising Wesley. Is I mentioned earlier that I never saw Wesley's disability, and that was a concept that a lot of the parents of children with special needs could never understand, because they always looked at Wesley or their disabled child as a burden, and I never saw Wesley as a burden. A lot of times parents isolate their children. Well, as you can see by the photos, I never isolated Wesley. I did everything to make the world inclusive for him. But the one thing that I did differently than other parents was I never hired an attorney. There were so many advocates out there telling people that, you know, at the time with inclusion, that, you know, people aren't going to embrace you unless you force them to include Wesley into the community and into preschool. And I said, I'm not going to do that because I don't want to force people to embrace Wesley. I wanted to do it because they want to do it. And Wesley was a member of Irvine swim team, the same swim team that produced Amanda Beardo, Olympian. And I have to tell you, this community was so wonderful. And the reason was because I wrote them a nice letter telling them why I wanted Wesley to be part of the swim team. After the year was over, I had so many people thanking me for doing that. And then the second picture is of how I was able to convince the preschool to include Wesley in their preschool program, and they embraced him fully. And he was in that program for 2 years. And, you know, here's the kids playing out in the street. I always welcome kids to come play with Wesley, even though he couldn't pedal the trike. It's amazing what kids can do. Look at those kids right there. They're pushing Wesley. It just brings back so many wonderful memories of my life with Wesley. Step four, substitute selfless and practice empathy. You know, so many people that are grieving, what we call the grief Olympics, they turn grief into a competition. Nobody can measure the grief and pain of anybody. And when you start turning it into competition, it just creates more conflict and more than that, segregation. And also, it's not a way to practice empathy. And also, grief doesn't discriminate, it doesn't care how a person dies. And one of the other interesting concepts I discovered, especially because through my experience of passing Preston's charm before Wesley's death, is I was already practicing empathy with Bridget to help her overcome her loss. And then when Wesley passed away, it made me realize that empathy is a two-way street. In order to receive empathy, you I also had to practice it, but I already practiced it. But even after Wesley's death, I have to practice empathy for my ex-wife, who is the mother of Wesley, the surviving siblings of Wesley, and even my friends. And that's a hard thing to do because a lot of times people get so caught up in their own pain that it's about give me, give me, give me, and not realizing that you also have to give empathy to all your surviving family members, friends, and anybody else that you want to help you. And so I came up with like using the golden rule that we've been taught early in life as kindergartens. And so it's a similar with empathy. Practice empathy for other people the way you'd like them to practice it for you. Step 5, substitute sadness with happiness. Now, this is kind of tough thing to embrace too, because a lot of people feel like anger, you have to be sad 24/7, and you don't. Death is only one event in your loved one's life. There are so many wonderful memories that you can refer to, and that's what the focus should be. And so, what Preston's charm and Wesley's charm had done for me and a lot of families who also have charms is that it reminds them to create pockets of joy to replace the sadness that you feel. And there's also some misconceptions about grief. One, there's no expiration date on grief. It really stays with you for the rest of your life. And I think one of the struggles people have in getting stuck is they're trying to make it disappear, and it's never going to go away because the key to it is learning how to manage it. And when another person is able to manage his or her grief and move forward with life, doesn't mean it has lessened the grief and pain. My pain for Wesley and Bridget's pain for Preston stays the same no matter what. It's just that we're able to manage it better. And support groups can also alienate a person who has managed to find peace and joy. What we find out a lot of times is people that go to support groups, they come back feeling cheery and joyful. They've gotten to a new level. Unintentionally, what happens, and people start to push them out, and they wind up leaving. And then the leadership doesn't turn and find ways to bring them back. Because they get so caught up in the pain that they don't realize we need those people to be mentors and provide success stories for other people that come in. So it's important to keep these people in support groups to serve as role models. Step 6, substitute fear with reassurance. Here are some of the fears that people struggle to overcome: their own mortality, the unknown, what's going to happen, how am I going to deal with this? Many of us lack the coping skills on how to manage grief. Also, how people will react. We're afraid, how are people going to respond to what we do? And in most cases, people don't respond very well because we haven't taught people how to respond, and it pushes people, the griever, more and more into isolation and lacking the skill to communicate how they feel and what they need in order to help them learn how to manage the grief. And then, of course, struggling to kind of get a visual of what life is going to be without their loved one. What are ways you can reassure yourself that you're moving forward with life? One is to really seek counseling, which a lot of people don't really do. But I think it's a necessary thing because, it's like back to asking for help. It's a way to ask for help. You can also hire a grief relief life coach. They're not as expensive and they're a little bit more accessible. Keep a positive attitude about grief, as I refer to my 10%, 90% rule. Practice self-care, and sometimes you have to be your own cheerleader because sometimes people are around there. And I tell people sometimes, I said, especially when I'm counseling them, talking them on the phone, I ask them, and when I'm talking to them, I say, well, you made a lot of progress. Do me a favor, when you get off the phone, promise me you'll pat yourself on the back. And sometimes I'll call them back and ask them if they patted themselves on the back, and some people forget. So I do follow up with that. And the other thing too is if you're a couple and you've lost a child, is it's so difficult, but you got to nurture your marriage again. It's like I said before, you're creating a new version of your family, and it's falling apart. Well, you got to nurture the marriage and start dating again. And then another way you can reassure yourself is to network with people who successfully found peace. Don't be jealous that they were able to find peace. Is reach out to them and find out, how did you do that, and how can you help me reach that level of peace. And the other thing I would love to see support groups now too is encourage people to invite, a relative or friend to attend and support the group. I mean, how are people going to understand what our life is like if we don't let them into our world? Number 7, substitute turmoil with peace. Trauma after death of a loved one can manifest in various ways. Drama exists even before the death of a loved one, but you have family conflicts, legal battles, people fighting over, inheritance, or the way the funeral's got to be, whatever, and then there's financial disputes, and then of course you have emotional struggles where everybody in the family is dealing with grief differently. So one way to resolve creating peace is what I use an acronym. It's called ERROR, because a lot of times when people bring drama and turmoil in your life, it kind of suffocates the oxygen out of you. So one way to find peace is to avoid it, ignore it, or remove it. And the third one is definitely hard to do, removing, because you've got family that you feel that you need to be committed to having a loving relationship. But if they're bringing turmoil and drama in there, can at least avoid it, ignore it. If that doesn't work, then don't feel guilty about removing them from your life for a while, and take a time out, because you don't need that in order to reach peace, right? And I love this quote: "On the other end of your suffering lies a gateway to transcendence, peace, and inner freedom." And I can tell you from my personal experience, I am so grateful that I have found so much peace and happiness and joy, and that I've been able to use grief in that way. And I've seen so many families that are doing the same thing. It's just so wonderful to see. And what I've done and what Bridget's done that's really been helpful, and what I'm seeing a lot of other families that are doing that have embraced the concept of Preston's charm, is that they've used grief to find a greater purpose. A gentleman that I met, Rick Capco, lost his son in an accident. There was a police chase, and unfortunately, the criminal crashed into Brian's car and killed him. And so they created the Brian Capco Foundation, which raises money to provide scholarships to students at the high school that Brian went to. And then Andrea Thornton and Corey Thornton, her husband, they lost 2 children. Autumn at 5 months old from choking, and then they lost their teenage son because he was murdered. When Autumn received the charms that we sent them for Autumn and Corey, she started a business called Autumn Leaves Leatherworks. Again, she was also into crafting and decided to start a business, and she's used Autumn's death and grief as a way to start a business. And she said when she goes out and sells her products, that it gives her a chance to actually talk about grief. Again, back to what I said, it's amazing how these charms have been kind of like an icebreaker to talk about grief. And she said it's been great therapy for her. And then Susan's story is very interesting. She's one of the ladies that have submitted essays for the new book that I'm going to write called Let's Talk Grief. And in the first chapter, I'll have essays of people that have written, and also in chapter 10. And then in between, I write about the 8 steps. Susan's daughter had passed away, and Susan, when she grew up, she grew up in London. Her parents did missionary work in Sierra Leone. And after Ashley died, she decided to go back to Sierra Leone and create a clinic in 2018. And it's been going on for 4 years. And they're actually been so successful that they're going to open up another clinic in Sierra Leone. So her greater purpose was not related to grief. It was something that she was passionate about, and it's serving other people. And if you don't have the energy and time to, do a foundation, because it does take a lot of work and time, you can also support someone else's greater purpose. The passing of Wesley's charm, um, as I mentioned, I'm doing a USA tour, and that's my greater purpose. And I am meeting amazing people along the way. And this one couple I met at a restaurant sitting there, we talked for 2 hours, and I decided to give them a charm. And during the conversation, Kathy said that she was going to play in the poker series tournament in Vegas at the main draw. You know, she had to do a buy-in for $10,000, and her husband said, "Yeah, it's either that or a new driveway." And you know, he supported her passion to and goal to want to play in there. And then when I gave her Wesley's charm, the first thing she said to me was, "I'm taking him to Vegas." So Wesley got to play at the World Series of Poker, and she sent me a picture of her at the poker event, and then a picture of. I also wound up giving her one of Preston's charms, and she stayed at the Wynn Hotel and sent me this picture. And last month I had left, or actually a couple of weeks ago, I had left one of Wesley's charms. You know, you can just leave the charms anywhere you desire, and I happened to leave it at this trail over in Upper Michigan, and this a lady, Riley, picked it up, and she wrote me this beautiful letter about how she picked up the charm, and when she looked at it, she goes, "Oh my God, that's the same day that my dad died." And she felt like that was like a divine intervention thing. And I can tell you, I've had so many divine intervention moments and through this journey. It's incredible. But anyway, after she wrote this beautiful message, I told her that I would send her 10 free charms of her dad. So she sent me a picture of of what she wanted on the charm. So she'll be getting those charms soon. I want to close with a little story about after I heard received news about Wesley's death. Before Wesley's death, my other son Matthew, the youngest one of the family, I had three boys, Grant, Wesley, and Matthew. Matthew and I had scheduled a time to travel around the world, and one of our stops was India because Matt's a professional volleyball player, and I was going to spend the whole season with them, and then we were going to go to Vietnam. Everything was planned, itinerary was set, and then when I got news of Wesley's death, I contemplated whether I should go or not. And I was so thankful I wrote Preston's Charm book, because in chapter 2, we talk about the forgotten mourners, where, you know, parents can get so caught up in their pain. We've seen this over and over again. So much time and energy is focused on the death of the child that's dead, and we forget about the other siblings. And I almost canceled the trip, and I had to really talk to myself and say, "You can't do this to Matt." And while I was doing this in my head, the phone rang, and Matt's on the other end, excited about the whole trip, and he handled all the itinerary. And I'm thinking to myself, like, you know, how many parents get the honor of a child that wants them to travel with them, let alone around the world? And I said, I can't do this to Matt, and I can't do it to myself, because Matt was grieving too. And I didn't tell Matt, and I just was really excited about going. So we go to India, and I get there, and Matt tells me that he brought Wesley's ashes with him, and I'm going, "Oh my God, what a great son!" Because I didn't even think about doing that. And he says, "I want to leave Wesley's ashes somewhere on this trip," and I said, "Okay." So we go through the season. It went great. He was the captain of the team, and they made it to the playoffs. And after the trip, we went to the Taj Mahal, and we were going to leave like 2 days later. And I asked Matt, I said, "Well, where are we going to leave Wesley's charms?" And he said, "Well, I don't want to leave it in India." Well, there I went again, thinking like my ego got the best of me for a moment. And I said, "Well, I want to leave the charms here in India." And then I said, "No, no, no. You know what? Matt brought the ashes. Sometimes you have to let go of your own grief in order to not only practice empathy, but also to support somebody else's grief." So I just stepped back and said, "Okay, man, wherever you want to leave him." So he decided he wanted to leave him in Vietnam. And meanwhile, I'm playing in my head, well, you know, we got to find the perfect place. Well, you know what? I let him take the lead, and look at this pictures. He found the perfect place. Nobody was there. It turned out to be a beautiful moment. So we get back to the United States. 7 months later, Matt went back to India, and he sends me a text, and all it is a video of him putting Wesley's ashes in the Ganges River. So because of me letting go, my dream eventually came true. So I'm continuing my Let's Talk Grief USA tour. If you want to learn more about it, you can go to this website, www.letstalkgrief.org, not .com, but .org. And this is the camper van I'm traveling in. As you can see, there's advertisements on there to spread the word to everybody to Let's Talk Grief anytime, any place. I want to share this wonderful quote that I received or heard about on America's Greatest Talent. Matt Mauser is the husband of the wife who died in the helicopter crash with Kobe Bryant. He was on AGT and he was singing a song in honor of his wife, and his kids were there. And he had told a story, and this is what he said. I would like to make sure that my children see that despite the grief that we've been through this year, that grief is not going to define who we are as a family. And that my children see that you have to find joy in life and have to continue. If this in any way can help my children to chase their dreams, then I'll take it. So together, let's stop the silence, stop the anger, stop the secrecy, stop the selfish behavior, stop the competition, stop the segregation. And together, let's start talking about grief anytime and any place, healing with grace and in harmony, and creating a healthier grief culture for the next generation. Thank you so much for having me. God bless. And I hope you can find a way to grieve in harmony.